Hey, noble ones, just letting you know that I'm doing a little bit of an inventory clear out, selling one of my samurai sets of armor, selling a few helmets, selling a vest, because I'm done filming with these and I'm gonna make space for new sets of armor and helmets that I will use in my productions. We are selling these on my wife's Poshmark, you'll find a link in the description, and also have a look at it periodically to see if we have put more things for sale. We only ship to the US. Thank you so much. Hey, noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we are reviewing Lex Fridman's podcast titled The Roman Empire, Rise and Fall of Ancient Rome, which has as a guest Professor Gregory Aldrete. Now, this is my third episode of this series of reviews of Lex Fridman's awesome work, by the way. I love his podcast. He did a very good job with this specific guest. In the first episode, we reviewed this section here titled Ancient World. In my second episode, we reviewed the section about Cleopatra. But today, we are going to talk about armor. Oh my god, get ready for pedantic. With that being said, I would like to underline that I am pathologically obsessed with armor. I mean... Let's jump into the episode.
One of the fascinating things about your work, you study Roman life in the ancient world, but also the details, like we mentioned. You are an expert in armor. So what kind of, maybe you could speak to weapons and most importantly armor that were used by the Romans or by people in the ancient world?
Absolutely, absolutely. I love this. I'm really looking forward to this also because keep in mind that Professor Aldrete is the one man, and I've read and followed his project quite closely. He recreated a linothorax. So I suppose that he's going to mention here. It's going to be really interesting to hear that and hear his perspective. And I also want to see what he's going to say about armor.
I do military history. So, I mean, the Romans specialized in... early on, they have pretty random armor and it's not standardized. I mean, remember, there's no factories in the ancient world, so nobody's cranking out 10,000 units of exactly the same armor. Each one is handmade. Now, there could...
Absolutely, particularly before the empire, when being a Roman legionary became a profession, then a certain level of standardization did occur, but as the professor pointed out, everything was still made by hand. With that being said, when we do read the sources on how they, during the Republic, they were making helmets, it very much depended on your social level and how much money you had, how much land, like landowners were the ones that could afford to buy a panoply or to have armor. But we do have several mentions of, for example, helmets that had the knob off center because they were put together quickly because the person that was buying it didn't pay much. So absolutely, as he said, very, very handmade production, of course.
Could be a degree of standardization. Even as early as Alexander, there was a certain amount of standardization. But each one is still handmade, and that's important to keep in mind. Each weapon, each piece of armor. Armor develops over time to fit the tactics. So the Greek hoplites are very heavy armor. The Roman infantrymen early in the Republic is light.
Okay, this is a little bit of a mistake on the editor, but this happens on my side as well, particularly when I work with many editors. So this is not an attack on Lex, but I think if the professor had seen this picture was the one going up when he was mentioning the Republic, then this is more of a picture that represents a Roman during the imperial time, and I think a picture of a Roman soldier wearing lorica hamata or lorica gallica, so male, would have been more appropriate. But then again, not a big deal, and it's an awesome picture, by the way, really. And I love the fact that he's not wearing bracelets, leather bracelets. So, fine, you're excused.
Later, eventually they get this typical sort of, chainmail shirt, helmet, shield. The classic sort of Roman legionary, I would say, is the one of the 1st and 2nd centuries AD. So
that's the one that now should have appeared. It would have been nice, I think, from an editing standpoint, that up to this point, we would have had lorica hamata, kind of the Julius Caesar type of helmet with the bronze Montefortino helmet or brass Montefortino helmet, depending. That would have been cool to see, so that then the audience could see the change as we go into a 1st century, 2nd century type of soldier.
Early Roman Empire. And this is the guy who wore bands of steel arranged in sort of bands around their body. So it looks almost like a lobster's shell, right? And
notice that he said steel. I'll jump into that later on the video. I'll kind of provide more context on that, on why he didn't say iron. He probably will say iron as well. He's correct. Steel is not a modern invention, and I'll tell you why he said that.
This is a thing called the lorica segmentata. So it's solid steel, which is very good protection, but it's flexible because it has these individual bands that provide a lot of movement.
Yeah, lorica segmentata was a fantastic invention. I own one. I've owned several types. My earliest one that I bought was a Corbridge Type A, so the one with the leather straps to connect the pectoral plates onto the rest of the chest cuirass. Then my second one was a lorica segmentata Corbridge Type B, so the one that substituted the leather straps with copper hooks. But then my third one, which is my current, I went back to the Type A because I prefer the leather straps over the hooks. Makes it easier to put it on yourself.
And then you have a helmet, you have a square shield that's kind of curved, and you have the short sword, the Roman gladius. And that's...
I've already complained enough about the idea of calling the gladius a short sword, because in period wasn't necessarily short, it was standard length. Compared to the late Roman Empire and mostly the Middle Ages, then sure, it would be a short sword by comparison. But if you look at the classical antiquity, Greek swords, Egyptian swords, swords in general, that was the length of a sword. I'm not going to go too deeply into that because I already mentioned it on other videos, don't want to bore you to death.
Kind of the classic Roman legionary. Later, more things develop. My personal sort of relationship with armor is I got really by accident involved in this project to try to reconstruct this mysterious type of armor that was used.
I knew it. I knew that he was going to talk about the project. I'm really glad to hear it directly from him. Now there is a mysterious type of armor. Of course, he's talking about the linothorax. I have a lot to say about the linothorax, so let's see what he's going to say.
Especially by the Greeks and Alexander the Great, called the linothorax, which apparently was made only out of linen and glue. So this seems a little odd.
That's one of three possibilities or possible interpretations, or should we say speculations, on how linothorax was made. The glue version is one out of three.
You know, that's not the sort of material once you want metal or something. But we had clear literary references that people, including Alexander, and the most famous image of Alexander is this Alexander mosaic found at Pompeii that shows him wearing one of these funny types of armor.
Let me show you. He's talking about this image. So as you can see, indeed, he is wearing linothorax. Now, I'd like to underline, however, that as you see, yes, it is in metal armor. It's made of linen, possibly multiple layers of linen, but there is a section here that most likely is scales of metal. This could have been made of bronze, could have been made of copper, so metal is also part of it. But he's absolutely correct in saying that yes, this is the armor that normally is associated in this mosaic with Alexander the Great. Just wanted to show you this. Let's go.
The catch is none survived. It's organic material.
I was going to say organic, yes.
So we don't have any of them. And archaeologists like to study things that survive. So we have nice typologies of Greek armor made of bronze, Roman armor made of steel or sort of proto-steel. But this...
See, now is underlined proto-steel. He's still using steel, if you noticed, and I agree with him 100%. I'll jump into it later.
This linothorax, was a mystery. And one of my undergraduate students, a guy named Scott Bartell, had a real...
That's the guy you shot, right? With an arrow. With an arrow.
An Alexander obsession. He really loved Alexander.
As one should.
He had Alexandros tattooed on his arm in Greek. And he was a smart student. He was really smart. And so he one summer made himself an imitation of this thing of Alexander's just for fun. And he said, can you give me some articles so I could do a better job? So I some scholarly articles about this armor. And with typical sort of, academic arrogance, I said...
Yes, scholarly articles. Now maybe, but if this is talking about when he actually started the project, I imagine he wouldn't have found many. I like that he's now saying, scholarly arrogance, because it's pretty cool. I like Aldrete.
Why, Scott, of course I will. I'll give you some references. And I went and looked and there weren't any. So at that point I was like, tell you what. Why don't you and I look into this and...
find the sources, which is, by the way, the best way to do it always. Because, yes, reading what someone else said, or reading the ideas of modern historians, or just reading books that someone has written on the interpretation of the sources, it's definitely a good way to begin a study. But if you really want to go deep, and that's what we do here as a team constantly, which is why production sometimes takes a little longer when it comes to the deeply researched videos, is that we always go back to the sources, and primary sources, secondary sources, even better not in translation, if you can access the original language, is the best way to do it, because otherwise whenever you repeat something that someone else says, even if it's a book, even if it's a historian, they might be getting it wrong, or they might be repeating something that someone else has said, and you might be pushing a myth. Now, as you know, if you have seen the other episodes of this series, sometimes I've agreed with Professor Aldrete, other times I strongly disagreed. And personally, I don't think there's anything wrong with disagreeing with someone as long as I'm being respectful and I'm attacking the argument, not the person. Moreover, I do in fact believe that disagreement within academia is a great way to foster critical thinking and to open discourse that can help us find the truth. Now, I did notice that in the comments there was someone who was really enraged and told me, how dare you? Who do you think you are, YouTuber? Arguing with a professor? Let me say something about that. There is a name for that sort of attitude, and it's called argument from authority, and it is a type of logical fallacy. And there are many reasons as to why it's a really, really bad red flag when that happens. First, I think anyone should be able to always challenge what professors say. Also because, at the end of the day, just because someone is educated, it doesn't mean that they are intelligent. In fact, intelligence and education, I've met in my life quite a few highly educated idiots. Not the case for Professor Aldrete, but just putting it out there. Secondly, I have met in my life an awful lot of people that, even though they didn't have a degree, maybe they couldn't afford it, they're very intelligent, that they also spent a lot of time researching stuff out of passion, and they can be very knowledgeable, and therefore their opinion will always be welcome, and I will never try to shut it down just because I may have a degree and they don't.
Try to do a reconstruction using only the materials they would have had in the ancient world. And little did I know at the time, I thought maybe I'll get an article out of this. It ended up being a 10-year project involving, 150 students, a couple dozen other faculty members, ended up having 3 documentaries made out of it. And Scott and I ended up writing a scholarly book on this. So this is how, you never know where your next project's going to come from. So it started with this undergraduate.
Fantastic. That's like the passion of historical reenactors right there. And I like it when historians or academics are also ready to get their hands dirty and try the stuff. Because to me, yes, academic knowledge is absolutely important, particularly to understand the cultural and historical surrounding elements that, you need to know in order to really understand armor and how it functioned. But also experiential knowledge is extremely important. Just because a degree costs a lot of money, it doesn't mean that the experience that a historical reenactor is gathering when they actually have a historically correct type of armor and they experience marching in it, sleeping in a tent, all of that is fantastic. So the two things paired together really help us achieve a full picture and understanding of what it meant to use armor. Because otherwise, if you only have experiential knowledge, then oftentimes there are reenactors that say things that they heard other reenactors say, but they never really looked at the sources, and they may be saying something wrong. But on the other hand, if you have academics that never even tried to put armor on, they will say stuff such as, oh, in Lorica segmentata it was so heavy, or Lorica segmentata you can't really breathe on, and then they wouldn't have made that mistake if they had put one on.
It turned into this huge thing. But it's what we did. We first said, all right, what are all the sources for this armor? And
I hope he's going to share some of the sources. If he doesn't, I'll do that.
In the end, we found 65 accounts of it in ancient literature by 40 different authors. So we have literary descriptions. And then we looked at ancient art, and we were able to identify about 1,000 images in ancient art in vase paintings.
Oh, look at that. That is beautiful, by the way it looks. I absolutely love ancient Greek art. See, that's the next type of armor that I need to get. Look at the closing method that you can see here. You can kind of make out the way it was connected. It seems like this is a continuous panel, so it kind of wraps around you, and then you connect it on one side. And it is the left side, usually in armor that's the case, because that's the side where you carry your shield. So because any closure section that is not a continuum, or whether it be a plate of metal, bronze, iron, steel, or whether it be in this case organic, is an area, sort of a weak spot, if you will. It's an area where the armor could get compromised, particularly as you move. And therefore, any area like this usually tends to be on the side that is the most protected and the most defended, because it's your shield side. Fascinating stuff. And if you see this closing method at the top with the spolders, if you will, the these sections here, this will actually be the way that Romans would use and connect the mail armor as well. So they continued this methodology, but they applied it to a different type of armor, because that's the Romans 101. They see something that works and then they improve it and apply it.
Pottery, bronze sculpture, tomb paintings, all these different things showing this armor. And then using those two things, we tried to backwards engineer a pattern to say, well, if this is what the end product looked like, what does it have to look like when you make it? And then we tried to reconstruct one of these things using only the glue and materials. So
once again, yes, he chose the glue system. But let me tell you, because I don't think he's going to mention it. It doesn't seem like he's going to mention it. So I'm going to interrupt him for a second and tell you about the 3 speculative ways in which this form of armor, the linothorax or linothorax, I'm not actually sure how to pronounce it in English, was most likely made. So the 3 theories in questions are the glued linothorax, the quilted and padded linothorax, and the linothorax made from a weave of interlaced linen cords. Now, when it comes to the glued one, generally speaking, we are talking about an armored garment made of between 12 to 18 layers of linen, which are normally connected to each other with the means of animal glue. And if I am not wrong, I think it was indeed Professor Aldrete who was the first one to push forward this hypothesis, this idea. All of these 3 theories have strengths and weaknesses. Now, in my opinion, the quilted padded linothorax is the weakest of these theories, and it is more probable that it was either weaved or glued together. Also keeping in mind that most likely the manufacturing process involved other steps, such as hardening the fabric using a mixture of water and salt, possibly vinegar or animal glues, or maybe kaolin, gypsum. And the reason why I'm saying maybe is because there are conflicting sources on this. Interestingly enough, to also provide a small commentary when it comes to the image of Alexander the Great, not only we have the iconographic image that represents him wearing a linothorax, but we also have a very famous mention. Namely, Plutarch writes that at Gaugamela he wore, so Alexander the Great wore, open quotes, a breastplate of 2-ply linen from the spoils taken at Issus.
So we had to use, animal glues, rabbit glue. We had to end up sort of making our own linen.
And rabbit glue can be very smelly. Making their own linen, that's interesting. I wonder how they did the process, though.
Which comes from the flax plant. So we had to grow flax, harvest it, using only techniques in the ancient world. So modern flax goes through...
I respect that.
Chemical processes. No, we had to do this the old-fashioned way, spin it into thread, so the thread into fabric, glue it all together, and then the fun part was, once we made these things, we subjected them to ballistics testing. So we shot them with arrows, which again were wooden reconstruction arrows using bronze arrowheads that were based on arrowheads found on ancient battlefields.
That's how you do it.
To determine how good protection would this thing have been. And of course, the kind of fun one that everyone always likes and that the documentaries always want is at one point they're like, well, can you put Scott in one of these and shoot him?
Yeah.
And we're like, okay.
I wouldn't have done that. Like, I'll be honest with you, I wouldn't have done that. But hey, that's just me.
I mean, at that point, we'd done about 1,000 test shots. I grew up shooting bows and arrows. I knew exactly how far that was going to go. So it's one of these, don't do this at home, kids.
So there's a million questions to ask here, but, in general, how well, in terms of ballistics, does it work? Like,
yeah.
Can it withstand arrows or direct strikes from, like, swords and that?
Absolutely, Lex. And I like that you ask this question. I want to see how the professor answers. But the thing is this. Imagine it this way. Take one of those phone books, right? If you take a single page, you can go through it with anything, really, probably with this straw. But if you try and take this straw, in fact, even a kitchen knife, when the phone book is closed and you try and go through it, then you'll notice that when you layer many weak things together, eventually, once you pass a sort of, we could call it a critical mass number of layers, then yes, will become very difficult to penetrate. So I think that, ancient people were very proficient. They knew what they were doing, particularly when, the life of your soldiers and warriors is dependent on this. So if an academic like Professor Aldrete, in a situation where this is just done for a fun and interesting experiment from an anthropological and archaeological standpoint, is putting so much test into something that they're not wearing, apart from his student, they're not going to wear for combat, or that it's not supposed to actually save their lives, imagine how much more the ancient Greeks would have been very thorough in actually finding the correct number of layers that is not too much, so that now it's too bulky and I can't move properly, but it's also enough to be able to provide decent protection on the battlefield, where people are absolutely your enemies, not holding off.
Bottom line is a 1 centimeter thick linothorax. So laminated or even sewn, it doesn't have to be laminated, layer of linen is about as good protection as 2 millimeters of bronze, which was the thickest comparable body armor of bronze at the time. And we're talking 4th century, 5th century BC here. So classical and Hellenistic Greece. And that would have protected you from, let's say, random arrow strikes on the battlefield. So you could have gotten hit by arrows and they simply wouldn't have gone through.
What are the benefits? So is there a major weight difference?
Yes. So the benefits of this are it's much lighter than
He's absolutely correct there.
metal armor. So the linothorax is about 11 pounds. A bronze cuirass of comparable protection would have been about 24 to 6 pounds. A chainmail shirt would be about 28, 27 pounds.
Okay, I want to speak about that very briefly. 24 to 26 kilograms for a breastplate-backplate combination of bronze sounds a little excessive, unless he was meaning the entire panoply. To be honest, in my experience, I want to say that the weight of a bronze thorax, so front and back, breastplate and backplate, was around 6 kilograms. But regardless of that, since I can't really ask him to clarify the statement, I'll just assume that he meant the entire panoply. But regardless of that, his point is still valid, because an average linothorax, in my experience, would be expected to weigh between 3 to 3.6 kilograms. So we're pretty much talking about half the weight of a comparable bronze type of cuirass. Of course, he is talking about a 2 millimeters thick bronze. That is kind of an example that touches the thickest sphere end, if you will. You can find bronze that was a little thinner than that and still provided excellent protection, of course. But yeah, in general, absolutely, as one would think, a linothorax would be much lighter than a bronze counterpart in the realm of armor.
It's cooler. I mean, the Mediterranean's a hot place with the hot sun.
As a Mediterranean, someone who was born, bred, and lived in Sicily for most of my life, I agree.
Even today, a linen shirt is something you wear when you want to be cool. So it's much lighter. That gives your troops greater endurance on the battlefield. They can run farther, fight longer.
I don't know about the perspiration, though, of many layers of linen. Yeah, a linen shirt is definitely very nice to wear. We do a lot. In my family, for example, in Sicily, my dad likes linen shirts a lot. But then again, I'm not sure about the perspiration qualities of linen when it's like 16 layers.
It's cheaper. You don't need a blacksmith who's a specialist to make it.
I agree with him.
In fact, probably, this is interesting, any woman in the ancient world could have made one of these, because they were the ones who spun thread and sewed it into fabric. So I can easily see in a household a mother making this for her son, a wife making it for her husband. So it's a form of armor you could have made domestically.
I disagree with this point, Professor. Even though I may take the point that perhaps in a situation of distress, catastrophe, you could have had some improvised amateur linothorax produced at home if you really needed to, then again, that's not the way we are told in the sources. The production of linothorax was absolutely not a type of made at home in an amateur way sort of armor production. We have in fact a fragment from Sophocles in the Epigonoi that clearly indicates that there were weavers appointed for its creation, actual professional specialists, not your mum or your wife. Let me read this. And the helmets are shaking their purple-dyed crests, and for the wearers of breastplates, the weavers are striking up the wise shuttle song that wakes up those who are asleep. The weavers, people who were professionally appointed to make this type of armor.
Would have been, maybe not the greatest armor, but pretty good, pretty comparable to bronze armor.
And it's amazing that you used all the materials they had at the time and none of the modern techniques. But I should probably say, maybe you can speak to that, they were probably much better at doing that than you are, right?
That is a very good point. Very good point. In fact, this is something that has been in the back of my mind. The fact that the professor made this project together with the students is commendable. It's very nice, and I really like it as a nerd for armor myself. But then again, the end product most likely would not be representative of what a professional weaver that did this in the ancient period, that they have been doing it for generations in their lives, could have produced. In fact, if anything, I think if one of those weavers that produced armor specifically for Alexander the Great and his troops, if they were resurrected now and they would see the sort of armor that the professor made, or the sort of armor that sometimes some of us make, they would think is very, very amateur type of work. So he's bringing up a very good point. You can do the tests if you want, but then again, you don't do this. You're a professor at a university, I imagine, so that's what you do. You're not a professional weaver. You're not someone who knows how to create armor. You're not an armorer, and therefore that's why I really like it when you have experts in the field that are used to reproduce these, as for example Todd Cutler has done when he did his armor testing series. Todd really did a good job, because he called a professional bowman someone with the muscularity and the physique necessary to actually use efficiently a, for example, late 15th century, say, Mary Rose bow or a real long bow. So he didn't just put, oh yeah, I've been messing around with bows. No, someone that represents a real medieval bowman and the kind of strength that they could pull, because remember that not only these high poundage bows require a lot of strength. That's a medieval example. It wouldn't be the same in the classical antiquity, but still, as someone who does this and has the physicality of it and can pull like a medieval longbow all the way back to the ear, which I wouldn't be able to do, is a much better representation of what kind of power that could have been generated and that shot your armor. Secondly, he had a professional armorer who does this for a living and has been doing it for years, produce the actual breastplate. And Todd is very capable when it comes to making weapons, making armor, treating metal, and even then he didn't attempt to do it. He called a professional to make the breastplate, so that it would have been an excellent representation of the sort of breastplates that would have been produced by the very capable medieval blacksmiths. And then of course they have the historian Tobias Capwell, who is providing commentary. This is a much better way of recreating something that then, once you test it ballistically, will be a much better representation of what period people were actually able to do from a skill set standpoint.
Right, because like, again, generational, it's a skill. And it's a skill that probably is practiced across decades, across centuries.
He's correct.
In terms of producing the fabric, I'm sure they could do it 10 times faster than we could. Just that's a speed thing. But it's still
not just speed, though. I appreciate that, Professor Aldrete, but also quality.
Incredibly labor intensive. Where I think there's a big difference between our reconstruction and ancient ones is in the glue. So we ended up using a kind of least common denominator glue. We used rabbit glue because it would have been available anywhere and it's cheap. But in the ancient world, they did have basically the equivalent of super glues. I mean, we found, for example,
the helmets
that were fished out of a river in Germany that were had metal parts glued together that after 2,000 years of immersion in water were still glued together.
That is impressive.
So they had some great glues. We just don't know what the recipes for them were. So we went the opposite tack and said, well, we're just going to make something that we know they could have made. So it was at least this good. You know what I'm saying?
But
that's a very good approach.
This is a materials thing, but I think glue, aside from helping glue things together, it can also be a thing that serves as armor. So like if you glue things correctly, the way it permeates the material that it's gluing can strengthen the material, the integrity of the material. That's an art and a science probably that they understood deeply.
The process of lamination did add something. So there's actually a huge debate among scholars and actually a sort of amateur archaeologist that was this linothorax thing glued together, or was it simply sewn together? Was
Appreciate.
it composite, partially linen, partially leather, or other materials?
And like the spolas or the tube and yoke.
My honest answer is I think it's all of the above. Because again, every piece of armor in the ancient world was an individual creation. So I think if you had some spare leather, you put that in. If you wanted to make one that was just sewn together or even quilted, stuffed with stuff, you do that. Maybe you were good at gluing stuff, you use that. So I think there's no one answer. We investigated one possibility because we just had limited time and money and resources.
And limited time, it took 10 years. But yeah, I appreciate him. He's an excellent approach.
But I think all these other things existed at the same time and were variants of it.
Just
I want to say something about also because Lex asked about what would be the advantages and disadvantages of having a linothorax, particularly when you looked upon at a comparative key with bronze. And another thing that we have to consider is the fact that yes, if you shoot bronze, the arrow doesn't go through. If you shoot a well-made linothorax, the arrow doesn't go through. We spoke about the positive aspect that linothorax is lighter than bronze, but one of the down elements of any form of armor that is organic is that every arrow that hits it, every axe strike, every sword strike will cut pieces off. So when it comes to the actual longevity of the armor, then bronze would absolutely be preferable when it comes to that, because you will be cutting pieces off of the linothorax, and at one point it will become too old and you will have to replace it completely. Whereas when it comes to bronze, it can also happen, of course, but it's a lot more durable, and I can back this one up with the sources, of course. Curtius Rufus tells us that when halfway through the Asian campaign, Alexander's soldiers changed their armor because the original ones are too worn out. The old ones are burnt, which means that the majority of Macedonian soldiers had armor made of perishable material, linothorax or spolas, tuber yoke, but in leather. So this passage kind of tells us two things at the same time. It tells us that most likely this was the most widespread armor in Greek Macedonian world, but at the same time it also shows us the perishable nature of it and the fact that after a few usage, this sort of armor needs to be remade from scratch. Whereas bronze, which would have been, by the way, a lot more expensive and therefore only the richest could afford, would have had a much higher level of durability. So bronze is still an excellent choice, by the way, but of course it would have been heavier, and depending on the configuration it may have been a little more restrictive when it comes to mobility. But as I was saying when I mentioned the image of Alexander the Great, there was also an in-between, in the sense that people with money could have a linothorax but add metal elements like scales made of bronze, scales made of brass, possibly even copper, so that you would get sort of the best of both worlds. And that's the way I see high-end linothoraces and the way I think they should be compared with full bronze ones.
Just a small aside, I just think this is a fascinating journey you went on. I love it. Answering really important questions about, in this case, armor, about military equipment and technology that archaeologists can't answer.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
By using all the sources you can to understand what it looked like, what were the materials, using the materials at the time, and actually doing ballistic testing. It's really cool. It's really cool that you see that there's a hole in the literature. Yeah. Nobody studied it, and going hard and doing it the right way to sort of uncover this. I don't know. I think it's an amazing mystery about the ancient world.
I mean,
indeed. In fact, Lex, if you want, I would strongly suggest you to check out Todd Cutler's channel and his specific tests when it comes to 14th century plate armor, medieval plate armor against longbow and crossbow. You're gonna love it. If you like this idea, you will love those, I was gonna say movies, but those videos.
Shifting from just sort of Roman history in general to my research that I've done as a scholar, the theme that runs throughout my scholarship is practical stuff. Yeah. I'm interested, how did this actually work in the ancient world? Mm-hmm. So there's people who are much more theoretical, who look at, the symbolic meaning of something.
For our own investigation, our own question, as we're trying to answer whether the Romans had access to steel or not, I think the idea of intention, is it an intentional addition of carbon into the iron because metallurgists and craftsmen of the time were trying to achieve something more durable and more useful in battle? Is that something that we can apply to what we find within the archaeological record? As always, whether it be my channel or my Patreon, we are going to deep dive, but I want to give you a preliminary answer. Yes, the Romans absolutely had access to steel. So having answered that, I think what we're going to dive into right now is, well, up to what extent was it used? Was it common? Was it expensive? What kind of techniques did they have access to? And this is probably the part that is going to blow your mind the most. The Romans didn't just have steel in the sense that they figured out that by adding carbon into the mix, you will create a more durable and, in fact, generally speaking, better alloy. The Romans had access to pattern welding, compositional piling, crucible steel. Their competence within the metallurgical field is impressive. In fact, you know the so-called Damascus steel that you usually imagine and kind of connect to Damascus in the Middle Ages? Well, pattern welding of that type absolutely existed in the classical period too. In fact, I'll have to actually make a dedicated video to Damascus steel because that nomenclature in of itself is actually incorrect. More on that on a dedicated video if you're interested. I am of course going to show you several artifacts, we'll analyze them together, we will study the sort of very technical types of tests that were performed in order to analyze the chemical composition, but also the mechanical and plasticity deformation techniques applied. We will get into what we know about the actual manufacturing processes. And we will start by examining two specific blades of Etruscan origins. But before jumping into the extremely technical analyses of these blades, I want to give you these interesting statements that will act as a foundational basis to fully appreciate what we're going to discuss. Fact number one, as we examine many of the extant examples in the archaeological record in the classical period when it comes to blades, you'll see that there will be a lot of variation within the chemical composition and structure of the blades, which vary tremendously when it comes to the actual constituents that we find, which suggests a chaotic experimentation. This kind of helps us understand how they managed to do stuff that it's actually impressive even from the point of view of our present scientific understanding in an era where they didn't have the sort of technology that we did have. So once again, chaotic experimentation was something that was done by Etruscans, Romans, and even Celts as their artisans and smiths were trying to figure out better ways to improve their work. Fact number two, one of the things you'll notice today that when it comes to metallurgy in the classical period, oftentimes it's not even a matter of is this blade made of iron or is this blade made of steel. You do have several blades that are made of both. And what I find to be absolutely fascinating is that oftentimes this is intentional. For example, the very first blade that we're going to review in a moment, which belongs to the 7th century and is Etruscan in origin, has a core of almost pure iron, but then all of the edges and the tip are steel. Fact number three, and this is really my favorite, among the blades that we're going to review today, you will find blades that had, of course, two edges, one being iron and the other edge being steel. So the two blades that we're going to examine today to kind of have an understanding of what the Romans had access to are Etruscan. The first blade is from the 7th century, as I was saying, and it's normally called or referred to as the falcata of Vetulonia, which is actually an incorrect nomenclature because it's not a falcata, it's a coppice. So I will be leaving a link to the study that actually discusses in details all of the technical analyses that were performed on this blade in order to assess the chemical composition and how it was created. Keep in mind that even though that study was extremely professional, they did call it a falcata even though it's a coppice. And then the second blade that we're going to examine is the daga of Chiusi, which is still Etruscan but from the 3rd century BC, so two different eras. Now, one question that you might have is, but we're talking about the Romans, so why are we examining Etruscan blades? Well, first and foremost, these two specimens are actually extremely revealing when it comes to the techniques employed or applied at this time. But also the very statement, but why are we looking into Etruscan stuff if we are talking about the Romans? It's kind of a statement that shows a little bit of a lack of understanding of how much the Etruscan culture and the Roman culture overlapped. The two blades that we're going to review now are from the 7th and 3rd century respectively, the coppice and the dagger, and through a comprehensive analysis and detailed examination of the mechanical properties and chemical attributes of these manufacts, we can understand the cultural, socio-economic situation, but also the techniques applied and the interaction between the Romans and the Etruscans. To examine the chemical composition and the non-metallic inclusions, two specific tests were used: electron microscopy and energy dispersive spectroscopy. This was operated through the argon plasma ray, which fully assessed the metallic matrix and chemical composition. Subsequently, the thermodynamic treatment allowed specialists to formulate a new possible hypothesis about the average temperatures reached in the ancient reduction furnaces used to make these weapons. This is the section we could consider quantitative information. Furthermore, through the technique called electrodiffraction, it was possible to measure the crystallographic orientation within several regions of the blade. Let's begin from the results that have to do with the mechanical composition of the alloy. And the first thing that we notice, which is very interesting, is that the structural organization derivates from two specific techniques: soldering by friction and a technique within metallurgy called fagoting. And this is interesting because it gives us insight into the sort of metallurgical understanding that the artisans of central Italy in the classical period had. The coppice from Vetulonia is 58 centimeters long, while the daga of Chiusi is 40 centimeters long. Two samples have been taken from the sword of Vetulonia, from 160 millimeters and 190 millimeters from the tip, whereas when it comes to the daga, the sample was taken from 125 millimeters from the tip. The samples were then also analyzed by immersion in nitrile, 1%, 5 seconds for the copies and 7 seconds for the daga, respectively. So when I said earlier on that this is definitely steel, is because of the sort of results that we get when it comes to the amount of carbon found in the blades. Namely, a range between 0.15% and 0.25%. Keep in mind, however, that both samples have gone through significant corrosion, and the areas that have been interested by the corrosion have a much lower carbon content quantity, between 0.05 and 0.07%. The blades also contain silicium, aluminium, and manganese. Another thing that is interesting is the chromatic difference between several layers within the blade. What this means is that these blades were not a single sheet or strip, but they were made of 5 different sheets of metal soldered together. All of this on top of a core of almost pure iron. All these 5 strips featuring a different amount of carbon content. Moreover, both lateral sides showed a significant amount of pearlite and ulterior external carburation. The hardness of the blade moves from 131 HV to 217 HV on the areas which contain pearlite. At 42 mm reaching the edge, the hardness value is 209 HV. As mentioned before, both blades experienced significant corrosion phenomena. The blade was greatly oxidized, particularly in the section perpendicular to the longitudinal axis. Now, one thing you might not know about iron and rust and oxidation is that iron oxidizes and the rust follows very predictable patterns within the strata or the layers, as it goes through favorable direction within veins based on non-metallic inclusion. Now, going back to crystallography, which, for those who don't know, it's a fundamental subject in the fields of material science and solid-state physics, the results show the presence of several processes of plastic deformation within the crystallographic structures of the steel, and this was all deliberate. The tests also tell us more about the thermomechanical treatment applied. The average temperature reached for production is estimated at 1164 degrees Celsius for the Vetulonia blade and 1235 degrees Celsius for the daga of Chiusi. And there is also a very specific connection between the ability to control the temperatures reached by these furnaces and the 5-layered approach of these blades. The Etruscans used a technique called thermomechanical cycle, which in very simple terms is a situation of increasing the heat and then decreasing it rapidly. This may have caused the introduction of pearlite and bainitic ferrite, which is a type of microstructure that can form in steels. It is named acicular due to its needle-like shape, which is formed during the cooling process when austenite transforms into ferrite. This, in combination to all the different segments of the blade, guaranteed greater strength.
I'm simpler. I just want to know, how did this work?
Very cool.
So almost all of my books that I've written have started with some just, how did something work? And I'm trying to just figure out that aspect of it. And that's just, maybe it's a personality thing. I also have kind of a sciencey background, so I think I've used a lot of that. Even though I'm a humanist and a historian, I use a lot of kind of hard science in my work. I did a book on floods where I had to get really heavy into, vectors of disease and, hydraulics and engineering and all that stuff. And
Fascinating. I haven't read this one. I did read, of course, his entire project when it comes to the lenothorax reproduction, but I haven't read this one. I'll check it out.
I think, again, having that sort of hard science combined with a humanist background helps with those sorts of projects.
Well, like you said, I think the details help you understand deeply the big picture of history. And I mean, Alexander the Great wore this thing.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, so I think this is where we start. Yeah, that's kind of introduces to the whole section on Alexander the Great, which clearly could be the next episode or one of the next episodes. So let's see what we have got so we can choose. You can choose with a little in the comments. So we have a section on Alexander the Great that I could review. Roman law. I could do that one with my main historian, and the team is really good with that. Rome expansion, slavery, fall of the Roman Republic. Oh gosh, slavery. People are going to hate me if I talk about it. For some reasons, there are people that say that I'm pro-slavery. How stupid can people be when they make response videos to me? How can I be pro-slavery, crying out loud. Octavianus, of course we did Cleopatra, a massive section on Octavianus Augustus. I would love that since he's my favorite emperor. Religion in Rome, oh yeah, this is going to be about Christianity and possibly in comparison with the ancient gods and the cult of the ancestors. So this would be fascinating to make, considering that I have several videos on biblical translation and religion, story of religion perhaps, and the linguistics of religion. This could be a fantastic section, so let me know if that's what you want me to do. Emperors, Marcus Aurelio, taxes, maybe not taxes. I hope you don't all vote for taxes, because that could be a little boring. Fall of the Roman Empire and decisive battles. Okay, we've got a lot to cover, so let me know which one you want to see next in the comments below. And of course, thank you Lex Fridman, thank you Professor Aldrete, but most importantly, thanks to all of you for checking out this episode. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.